I bet all of us have heard demeaning words that humiliated us, and these words have been saved in our hard drive, which keep playing in the background for years together. Are you someone who's heard harsh, negative words from others, including your own family members, which made you feel miserable about yourself? Then this one's for you. Hello, people, and welcome to part two of childhood abuse and trauma. In the previous video, that is part one, I talked about what is meant by physical, verbal, psychological, or emotional abuse. I also elaborated further on how physical abuse is accompanied by psychological abuse to cause trauma. If you haven't watched part one, it is available on Embracing Diversity 15. The link is in the description. Today, I'm here to elaborate further on verbal abuse. Now, verbal abuse is the most common form of abuse, and the consequence of verbal abuse is always psychological and emotional wounds. It is even said that verbal abuse is a form of emotional abuse. Here, there is no involvement of physical bruises or impairment. However, negative, harsh words used repeatedly leave a lasting imprint on the human mind. This impacts your view of your own self and of the world. It impacts your thought process and the way you speak to other people. In fact, the negative self talk that we engage in also could be coming from the negative, harsh words we've heard about our own selves throughout our life, which distorted our self image. Verbal abuse is a silent killer. In fact, a person who is going through verbal abuse might not even recognize that the words being said are leaving a lasting impression on the brain. Now, verbal abuse can be accompanied by intense emotions like anger, frustration, etc. So, that is, somebody humiliates you using harsh words, which is accompanied by a harsh tone, maybe is shouting or yelling, and also has anger expressions. However, verbal abuse can also be done with a milder tone of voice and not so harsh expressions, like somebody mocking you, making fun of you, or being sarcastic. For example, somebody is saying to you, "Oh, look at her, she's so dumb," and then laughs about it and covers it up by saying, "Don't take it seriously, okay? I was just joking." Am I saying that joking is not a good thing to do? No. Trust me, every human being can sense if your intent is to put them down. And as I said in part one of the video, that verbal abuse is a pattern of speaking with the intent to humiliate, demean, threaten, or blame someone. Yes, there is a possibility that the person doing it might not consciously be aware of this intent. And where does this really come from? Maybe from their own exposure to verbal abuse and unhealed trauma. Let's take some real life instances to understand what verbal abuse looks like on a daily basis. Let's say there is this child who is ridiculed by the parent, and it can be either parent, the mother or the father, because abuse is not restricted to gender. Imagine that this child has failed in an exam and shares this with the parent because now the parent has to go and collect the report card. As soon as the child expresses that he or she has failed in an exam, the parent is agitated and says, "What have you done? You always let me down. You disappoint me. I feel so ashamed to come to your school and even meet your teachers. I feel ashamed to call you my child." Now the parent goes and finishes off the report card collection, comes back home and ridicules the child further by saying, "You're a disgrace to the family. You have disappointed me. You're such a failure. I don't know what you're going to do with your life." The day ends with quite a lot of ridiculing words said. The next day, the parent takes this child for a walk. Now, the child is already suppressed by the negativity of the previous day, is feeling bogged down by shame and guilt, and is not even able to look up and walk. The child is walking along with the parent, putting the head down, and they meet a neighbor on the way. Now the parent greets the neighbor, but the child fails to do so, and the parent gets agitated all over again and ridicules this child by saying, "Is there something stuck in your mouth? You can't even open your mouth and greet people." And they move on. Now they come back home, and this parent narrates what just happened to the other parent, and then they start with an argument. And there again, they put the blame of their fight on the child by saying, "Look at what you've done. We started fighting because of you. What a pain." The child is frightened, feeling miserable, worthless, on the verge of breaking down. But let's say it's dinner time and the parent says, "Go get your plate from the kitchen." And the child goes to do so, but with that guilt and fear, the plate slips from the child's hand and it breaks. And the parent goes on to threaten the child again by saying, "You can't get one thing right. If you make one more mistake, I'm not going to send you out to play with your friends." Now, let's reflect on this situation and let's look at both the parent side of the story and the impact it has on the child. We just saw four instances where the parent ridiculed the child and used harsh words like, "You're a disgrace, I'm disappointed with you, I'm ashamed of you," and things like that. The parent also went on to blame the child for the fight they had among themselves, as well as threaten the child that they won't send the child out to play with friends. Let's now assess the parent's intent. A parent doesn't consciously want to cause harm to their child. Therefore, parents don't really use negative and harsh words intentionally. However, like in these scenarios, the parent did unconsciously demean and ridicule the child. We also have to understand that the parent did not convey these harsh words in a neutral manner. There were intense emotions involved like anger, frustration, disappointment, shame, etc. Where does this actually come from for the parent? Let's figure out. So, adults, caregivers, and parents might not necessarily understand the consequence of these harsh words used. Sometimes parents might be upset about something else, and, like in these scenarios, get an excuse to vent it out on the child. Sometimes the parent is feeling shameful themselves about what the world is going to think of them as a parent if their child behaves a particular way. So they transfer that shame they are feeling onto the child. Unconsciously, of course. Sometimes, as parents, we think that if we shout and yell at the child, and they will learn from it. You want to fix their behavior and discipline them just like our parents did to us. And most of the reasons I just mentioned come from our own past experience because we didn't learn any other way to do it. Therefore, we believe that since what our parents did to us was the only way, that's the way we do it to our children. That's what generational trauma is about, right? It's like our grandparents did that to our parents did the same thing to us, and then we transfer it on to the next generation. So now we've looked at the negative harsh words used, we've looked at these scenarios and understood the parent perspective. Now let's look at the impact this has on the child. Dr. Gabor Mate says that trauma is not what happens to you, it's what happens within you. So it's not about the events that occur, but it's about the impact it has on you psychologically. Now we have to realize that children don't really know themselves well enough. Therefore, they view themselves through the eyes of the adults around them, including older siblings, neighbors, relatives, teachers, but above all, their own parents. Therefore, when these adults, especially the parents, ridicule the child constantly, this child comes to believe that what's being said is true. Children cannot see the underlying reasons behind your words, right? If you really say you're ashamed of your child, and if you question yourself later, you'll be like, "Of course, I'm not ashamed of my child. I just said it in a fit of anger." But your child doesn't know that. When you said you are ashamed of your child believed that it is true. And children sometimes get so negatively impacted by this. They go on to extreme thinking like, I don't know why I'm born. I wish I was never here if I'm creating so much of pain for my parents. They curse their existence. Your child looks up to you because you are their world. And when you show disappointment in them, they are disappointed with themselves. And they think of themselves as bad children. When they get blamed for your fight, they believe that that's true, that they are the cause of your suffering and your fights. And that's not true, right? Adults are responsible for their own words and actions. It's not your child's fault if you react that way. When your child is ridiculed for bad performance, getting bad grades, not speaking up, your child believes that they're not capable enough, they're not smart enough. Their self confidence is shattered because they believed what you said to them. When you threaten your child, the child soaks in that fear. And many a times, parents just use threats and might practically not do anything. But if you've threatened your child, that is leaving an imprint on their mind already, whether you do it or not. Just imagine this child in the scenarios I explained to you. Imagine that child's heart must have broken when the parent said that he is ashamed of the child, she is a failure, they're a disgrace to the family. The child doesn't understand where your harsh words are coming from, whether you really mean them or no, you're just saying it in a fit of rage. They are believing all that you say. Remember that whatever you say to your child is ingrained in the child's mind and is very difficult to change that even up to adulthood. We as adults are still struggling to change that, right? Your child doesn't understand the underlying reasons for your anger and frustration and disappointment. What you say builds into a strong belief. In conclusion, I'd like to say that verbal abuse is a very silent, subtle form of abuse. And many of us might not even agree that it is a form of abuse. You know why? Because we've normalized it. And why not? I mean, negative, harsh words, ridicule, humiliation is something we've faced in our own homes for generations together. So we've made that our way of living. And we never questioned it because we didn't learn any other way. We never realized really that it's those negative, harsh words said to us that built a negative and distorted perceptions of our own self. We could never believe that we are capable and enough because of all these negative words said, because we believed that it was true. You can break this chain of generational trauma if you identify that it happened to you too. Looking within, identifying what happened and how that impacted your life is the first step towards healing. I'll leave you to reflect on that today and stay tuned for the next part of this video on psychological or emotional abuse. I will see you next time.